Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Connect2Car Roundtable discussion entitled, What Do Autonomous Vehicles Mean for Regulation? Your moderator is David Zuby of the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. You are invited to submit questions for today's roundtable through the SAE International's WCX app. Ladies and gentlemen, David Zuby.
Nice chairs.
Comfy chairs.
Yeah, I guess they. Oh, yeah, perfect. These are comfort chairs.
Good morning, everybody. And I realize we've got a tough act to follow with robo race cars preceding us, but we've been having animated pre-discussions, so I'm expecting that we'll have pretty good discussion up here about what are the implications for regulation on autonomous vehicles and vice versa. My name is David Zuby. I'm the Executive Vice President for the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety and the Highway Loss Data Institute. And I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves and give you what is most front of mind for them when they consider what are the needs for regulation or as they contemplate a world where there are more vehicles with autonomous driving systems.
Hi, good morning everybody. My name is Nat Buse. I'm the Head of Safety at Uber Advanced Technologies Group in Pittsburgh. In that role, I'm responsible for many things related to getting that technology on the road in a safe way, especially as it applies to our approach. So our approach is really two ways. One is developing our own technology, and the other is by letting other platform providers come on. And so in that way, very interested in sort of how regulations are developed, what the industry can do to standardize those on its own. I would say there are probably two things that come to the front of my mind when we talk about regulations. One is, to my knowledge, it's been a very long time that the government will go out and set a technology standard for something that doesn't exist. Most of the regulations that are on the books have all come after some technology introduction. Here we're talking about a need to really have a flexible framework for this technology, and one that industry really has to step up to the plate and solve on its own. Really when we're talking about that self-driving system. And I would say that the other piece that is interesting around regulations has to do with the federal and state balance, especially as results to testing on public roads. There's not anyone in this industry that wouldn't say you have to test on public roads, but there needs to be a way to do that testing in a safe and responsible way, and we have to work with state regulators in order to make that happen, which means that we as technology providers, we as companies that are innovating, really need to figure out how to clearly define what testing means as opposed to deployment. So happy to be here. David, thanks for inviting me, and hope to have a good conversation.
Great, thanks. Hi everybody, I'm Kelly Nantel. I'm the Vice President of Communications and Advocacy for the National Safety Council. We're a nonprofit working to eliminate preventable death in our lifetime, and working pretty heavily in the AV space to ensure that safety has a strong seat at this table. And I think, to Nat's point about the framework, that's the thing that's probably the most important to us, is what are those voluntary standards that industry really needs to develop that will eventually become regulation. And then certainly, I know we'll talk a bit about consumer education and the real need to bring consumers along on the journey now and not continue to wait. So I'm excited to be here, David. Thank you for the invitation.
Good morning. I'm Desi Wikashevich. I am the Global Director of Ford Motor Company's Automotive Safety Office. I handle everything safety related to strategy, rulemaking, compliance, and program delivery. And it's an honor to be here with my esteemed colleagues and thought leaders in this space as we all embark on a journey to deliver autonomous vehicles. It's interesting as I reflect on my own experiences and the experiences in the industry, and if you think about rulemaking around autonomous vehicles is built on a very traditional framework. You have a mechanical system and a driver that interacts with the system. And in tomorrow's world of autonomy, it's a very different environment. And I think as in a collegial manner, we need to work together to bring the thoughts and the data together around what does rulemaking look like in the future, and how do we, through collaboration, serve as catalysts to really change how we deliver vehicles and deliver rules. Otherwise, we're stuck in a vicious circle around traditional data, traditional mechanical systems, and really no mechanism to facilitate rulemaking in a method that is expedient and consistent with where technology wants to go. As part of Ford Motor Company, I'm thrilled to be part of a company that really wants to deliver a mission to become the world's most trusted mobility supplier. And it's anchored on trust. And I think as we talk through today, one of the things that's really important for us as leaders in this industry is to continue to communicate and build trust amongst our constituents, our customers, the society, and that's to me the success of events like today. So thank you again, David, and it's great to be here.
Good morning. My name is David Vesno. I am the Executive Vice President of Corporate Development and Regulatory Affairs for an organization called LM Industries, which is the parent company of Local Motors. Local Motors is known for a couple of world's firsts. We've developed the world's first co-created vehicle, the world's first 3D printed vehicle, and now the world's first 3D printed co-created self-driving vehicle called Ollie. And so our perspective is on redefining the ride as the world's first digital vehicle manufacturer. And we're really focused on how do we make the vehicle using digital assets. And obviously that has a lot of implications because in the same factory that makes a 2-passenger vehicle, we can make also a 8-passenger shuttle without really any tooling changes because we use large-scale additive manufacturing. So I think beyond autonomous vehicles, I think the fact that we now can make vehicles digitally, there's a lot of impacts and implications for regulation. We believe that for autonomy to take off as for the promise that it holds in the marketplace, the least, I want to be careful, but yeah, we believe the least risk way to bring this technology to market is in low-speed controlled environments. For us, that means limited ODDs as well as speeds below 20 miles an hour, and that's where we're focused on. Right now, we're primarily deployed in private campus settings around the world. We have vehicles in Australia, Korea, Europe, and North America. And so if you're ever in the Washington, D.C. area, please visit us in National Harbor and experience a level 4 vehicle operating on about a 1.5 mile route. Look forward to the conversation. Thank you for inviting me.
Good morning, everyone. Tim Johnson. I'm with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So we're the government regulator in this space, responsible for regulating new vehicles and new vehicle equipment, and including ADS vehicles. And so I'll be pretty brief. What rises to my mind in terms of like the topic of this panel and what really bears on a regulatory framework and structure is really what's needed now is robust research and data. That's what's going to drive agency decisions. That's what's going to drive state decisions. You see a lot of notices coming out from the agency asking for input from key stakeholders. Most recently in the fall, we put out a notice, I think it was October, about an automated driving pilot program where we are again basically addressing this issue directly of that need to observe vehicles in various test environments. How do we best do that? What is the framework so that we can get that key decision-making data into the agency and into the community writ large so that we can put that framework in place that we're all seeking and move maybe more nimbly and quickly. But to do that, the agency is going to need really robust and comprehensive data to make those decisions. And so if that's lacking, obviously that time frame of making those decisions is going to be drawn out until we do get that data. So I'll leave it at that.
Hey everybody, I'm Eric Nice. I'm Vice President of Autonomous Systems in Aptiv's Autonomous Mobility Group. Many of you may be familiar with Aptiv as a Tier 1 provider of many advanced driving solutions into OEMs in the private ownership market. The Autonomous Mobility Group is focused on robotaxi type applications, so initial deployments of fully autonomous vehicles into the market, sort of in fleet type applications. I'm also an engineer by background, so I'm very interested in the technical side here. Aptiv has extensive experience dealing with regulatory compliance for all of its advanced driving systems, nationally, internationally. So on the one hand, we have a lot of experience there and confidence in how to make progress in those dimensions. On the other hand, as an engineer and as an engineer who has responsibility for things like deep learning systems and other extremely new and rapidly emerging technology applications, there's this question of what's the right way to apply regulation to a challenge like this, where we have to strike the right balance between a level of regulation that ensures that we are delivering safe systems. Aptiv's core mission is to increase safety, accessibility of driving technology, safe driving technology. So we need to strike the right balance between bringing to market safe products, but also recognizing, as mentioned, that we're trying to regulate some technology that is really extremely recent, or maybe does not even yet exist today. Some of the invention that's going to happen over the coming months and years. So just one other point that I would touch on, Aptiv also operates autonomous vehicles on the road in Boston, Pittsburgh, Las Vegas, Singapore, and as part of that, we deal with many different government agencies at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. In Boston alone, we deal with 4 different government agencies. So, you know, as we look to this technology to dramatically improve safety and cost, we also want to think about how can we speed the adoption of that technology, not just through public adoption, but also through regulatory support, so that we can get this technology out there, we can start saving lives, and the more that we can harmonize some of those regulations, some of those requirements, the faster engineers and others will be able to solve the problems that meet the regulatory requirements and the technology requirements.
Great, thanks everybody. I want to remind everybody in the audience that if you have questions, please submit them by the app. We've already got a couple of questions from the audience, but before we jump into those, I wanted to have you guys talk about one of the things that we talked about in our pre-meeting, and that was when you think about regulation for autonomous cars, there's sort of 2 themes. One is that current regulations pose hurdles for developing automated driving systems or deploying them on the roads. And the other is that maybe there are new considerations that need to be taken into consideration with respect to regulation. Maybe government regulators should be saying, thou shalt do this or thou shalt not do that when it comes to, you know, creating a framework for automated driving. And I think one example that's interesting to me is, you know, that there's a lot of discussion about telltales in the cockpit, right? Telltales that inform a human driver that something's wrong with the vehicle. Arguably, if there isn't a human driver in the vehicle, the telltale is there for no purpose. But in exchange, maybe the regulations say vehicles shouldn't be able to operate when the tires are underinflated. And what is the exchange that you guys are thinking about as you navigate this space when it comes, okay, most people can get that you don't need a telltale if there isn't a human driver, but what are we going to do in the autonomous driving space to make sure that vehicles aren't out on the road with passengers in dangerous conditions? Who wants to take that one? I can tell you want to say something, Matt.
So I'll start and maybe mention 2 things. So one is, I think sometimes when we have this conversation about regulations, we tend to forget that these vehicles actually are regulated. You know, those of us doing responsible testing on public roads know that we fall under the Safety Act and the defects process set up in place by NHTSA. So lest anybody walk away from this conversation confused or thinking that there are no regulations in place and it's just sort of people doing whatever they want, that's actually not true. What we're really talking about up here is this idea of things to come. And so, as Tim mentioned, the agency put out, you know, this notice asking for comment and input on regulating, let's call it the self-driving system, the autonomy stack, as aficionados would like to call it. And then there's also this question that David raises about the interior designs and how we think about that. So at Uber, we think about all of that. For one, we definitely want to make sure our vehicles can get to point A to point B, right? That's important. We have a rideshare business. We also want to make sure that they get there safely. That is a big key thing for us is safety, and so we're definitely focused on how do we assure the safety of our self-driving system. Related to that is then the occupant piece. And there are all sorts of conversations that happen, I'm sure, not only within Uber, but with other companies about looking at everything from where should you put screens in the vehicle so people can have a nice ride experience, to the counter of that, which is what happens if there is a crash and the occupant's head might hit the screen, right? That's all part of doing responsible safety engineering and looking at various things. I think one thing that we kind of lack the data on is the sort of what do consumers expect in that sort of environment. I think we're all thinking that small scale deployments, I'm sure David will have something to say about this, give us some insight into how consumers look and feel. I mean, we definitely are seeing lots of literature about everything from, there's apparently some number of the public that actually gets sick riding rear facing, and so that's something we have to think about. So all these things I think are questions that are not yet answerable because we don't have the data to understand which way to go yet. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about the changes that might be necessary from a regulatory standpoint.
Yeah, I think to your point, there's so much that is unknown, and if you regulate it now, then you're boxing yourself into a set of regulations that might be irrelevant, in a few years, and this is going to iterate for a long, long time. And so I think, as a safety organization, we often look to regulators and regulation to set the standards, and we certainly don't back away from that, but we also recognize that this is a really different environment that we're in, and I think that it's going to take a long, long time before we're in a position where we have enough data, to Tim's point, to really form regulations that will stick. Mm-hmm. Not that they won't evolve over time, but it's such a lengthy process that I think there's so much more we need to learn and understand about the environment and anticipate about the environment before regulations, and that's why I think industry standards are so important to get industry to come together and to agree upon a set of standards would really help advance.
I'd like to build on what Nat started this conversation around is we need to begin to imagine a very different experience. And the only way to enable this technology to not only be nurtured, but frankly to proliferate, is to step back and try to understand what the regulation is there for. And I won't elaborate on your Telltale example, but it is actually one of my favorite. When you go down a scenario around a today regulation for a vehicle with respect to safety, like Telltale's, it's set up, again, my starting comments around a mechanical device, a vehicle with a driver interaction, and a set of controls and mechanisms and viewing angles pre-set up or dispositioned around that driver. When that person, that driver, now is not in the vehicle, it's a very different scenario. And I think that we need to translate those requirements and their intent into a functional requirement that's still achieved, but not based on a mechanical interaction with the Telltale, for example. We may still want to give information to the passengers around, hey, the TPS signal went off, but it's still within normal monitoring, vehicle will continue. There might be a different way to inform the passenger. We may decide through research or other data that consumers really don't want to know, or passengers. And I don't know that, in this panel we're going to solve all those, but I think we need to, as an industry, all of you need to help us work together to navigate a much richer data set. Autonomous vehicles, innovation is what our country is based on. And if we can't harness a mechanism to go forward, to create different rules, we'll be sitting here in 1 or 2 or 3 decades and still talking about a vision to deliver a different framework.
I think classically, as you said, we've thought about the vehicle itself, and here we're talking about a technology that is operating the vehicle. And so the entire body of what we want to track, what we want to pay attention to, is going to change. We let people manage all of that, right? We let people have judgment, we let people operate the vehicle. Now suddenly it's not just about is the tire pressure low, but it may be about the sensors and the state of health of the sensors. It may be about how efficiently the software is operating. So we're sort of already in this transition period where we're seeing smarter, more connected vehicles that know more and more about not just the state of the vehicle itself, but the state of the environment. And we're growing into a position where there's so much more complexity around reasoning about that environment. So I agree, we have to be nimble in the way that we think about the requirements around what we develop, because frankly, we don't know what the right best answer is today, and I think an attempt to try and articulate that today is going to cut off a lot of avenues for how we can solve this problem.
I'll give the regulator the last word on this topic. So if I may chime in, I think there's a couple of points. One, you said, what are the barriers or obstacles? And there was actually a request for comments earlier last year on that topic. One thing that we see, and no slight to our friends in Dearborn, is that current regulation is potentially favors the big and the traditional. There's certainly parts of the FAST Act that have words in it that say established. So I think first step, what do AVs mean for regulation is we need to create a level playing field for all participants in the marketplace so that we can all succeed. And some of us have bigger war chests than others, but certainly that's one thing. I think the other thing is comes down to, as you started talking about, we're not just talking about the vehicle anymore and how is the box made and is the box safe, but we also are talking about in which environment is the vehicle operating in, and is it safe enough based on the requirements to operate in that environment, right? And so I think the route and the operator and how that mixes, and that's why we believe low-speed controlled environments are the way to bring this technology to market, because you reduce the risk in the risk profile, because the route is less complex than maybe some public road environments or all public road environments. So I think those are some of the things to take into consideration to answer specifically David's question of where are the barriers, and then what are the things we have to think about in the framework. I think it becomes not just about the vehicle, but within what environment is the vehicle operating that we have to start taking into consideration.
Yeah. No, I would just add, I think to some degree the regulatory hurdles and the regulatory framework discussion gets in the way, I think. It's much more the issue, I think, that when you get into automated driving systems, level 3, 4, and 5, you're replacing the driver and everything that the driver does. And that is a vast space. Their decision-making capability, their reaction capability, their ability to learn. And so there is just a huge body of work there that needs to be addressed in terms of that. We put out our policy, of course, where we have 12 safety elements in there. To comprehensively address all 12 of those is a daunting task for automated driving systems. So I think if both industry, government, other interested stakeholders, focus on that piece, what is that? How do you test it?
Yeah.
How do you make sure it's safe in a really robust and comprehensive way? Then I think the regulatory structure, I mean, we're of course working on updating and modernizing the regulatory structure, but as was mentioned at the start, I mean, there's a pretty robust oversight structure in place now. And so if there was an automated driving system out there, it's already covered in terms of our safety oversight, either by an FMVSS or by an enforcement mechanism or defects type of thing. So I think I said, nobody should walk away saying, it's the Wild West out there. There is quite robust safety oversight. Definitely want to modernize that and keep pace with innovation, but boy, there's just a heck of a lot to do in concert with that, I think.
So one of the things that we talked about in our pre-discussion, and somebody's submitted a question along the same lines, and Nat, I think you mentioned trying to get information about customer or public expectations. The regulatory process, we were joking, has got built into it a public comment process, but those of us who have read the comments around regulatory actions know that those comments are dominated by the regulated or safety organizations. Occasionally you see a bunch of comments submitted by members of the public, and often they're form letters that some organization has asked them to participate. Likewise, I'm sure that in the industry standard-setting forums, there is an opportunity for public voice. But often the public is not there at the meetings that I've attended in those spaces. So what are your guys' thoughts about how do we get information about customer expectations and the public expectations about what is safe? And I think there's some expectation on the part of most people that if it's on the road, it must be safe enough. But all too often, we read in the headlines about, just last year, big crash of a limousine. Which was exempt from a bunch of standards because it was a modified vehicle. And so there are gaps in the current regulatory space. How do we gather information in your thinking about more effectively than we have in the past?
I think a couple of things. One, PAVE, right? Early at breakfast, I made a remark that wasn't in private, that this organization is about consumer education. We decided not to join PAVE because we feel that we have a very unique approach to consumer education. We actually have a sales and demonstration facility in Maryland, and then we also have each one of our factories in Knoxville, Tennessee, and in Chandler, Arizona, that the public can come and visit, right? So we have pretty much an open door policy, and we do consumer education right at the point of vehicle development, vehicle sales, and vehicle deployments. So our perspective is we have to put consumers in the vehicle in a safe manner, obviously, to gather their feedback both quantitatively and qualitatively. How many rides are we doing? Are they incidents? And giving that feedback back to them in real time. And we publish that for, in the state of Maryland, for example, on a monthly basis to the Motor Vehicle Administrator. But then we have things that we just found out a couple of weeks ago. We had a situation where Ollie was operating in autonomous mode, and I have a pretty aggressive driver profile, so this wouldn't be a big deal for me. But what happened is there was a person halfway kind of in the pedestrian, and Ollie decided to go in front of that person. No incident, nobody got hit, nothing happened in that aspect, but one of the feedbacks from one of the riders was that she felt that Ollie was aggressively driving, right? And so these are all things that I think you can only get that feedback on to understand what consumers want from a ride experience if you actually have consumers in the vehicle.
Yeah, I think PAVE and what you're doing are very complementary to each other. So PAVE is the Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. It's an industry-led coalition that was formed earlier this year, announced at the Consumer Electronics Show. It is about 42 different organizations all coming together, everything from traditional OEMs to tech companies to startups to safety organizations and other association groups who have a stake in AVs. And the idea and the premise behind PAVE is really simple. It's education only. It's not lobbying. It's not influencing policy. It's educating, and it's primarily educating the public and policymakers so that their policies are informed by fact and not by rhetoric or hyperbole. Now, I was excited because earlier this week or over the weekend, one of the elements of PAVE's work is to do public demo days. And so we partnered with SAE here and did our first public demo day at about 600 folks from the greater Detroit area, members of the public who were curious, who came in. They did pre and post surveys to understand where they were and then where they are after having the experience, but working with data speed, putting them into the cars with a safety driver who can explain what they're experiencing and then getting their feedback. And I think that's absolutely right. You've got to engage the ultimate end user in the process and get their feedback and really think about it and apply their feedback if you want them to be a part of the, if you want them to actually use and demand the product. I think that's going to be absolutely critical. And so PAVE is just getting started, but I think the work is complementary. It's not in opposition of each other, totally.
Yeah, at Aptiv, we've had a similar approach, engaging the public, understanding what they want, what they need. We've actually run public trials in Boston, Singapore, and our largest operation is in Las Vegas, where we've given over 40,000 rides to the public through the Lyft network. So we use those opportunities to collect deep feedback, in some cases shallow feedback in others, but increase generally the exposure to the automated vehicle technology. You have to be a little careful because one thing we've seen too is that perceived safety and actual safety are not always, they don't move in lockstep.
Yeah.
You know, one really simple example of that is this idea that people are always very excited about their first ride in an automated vehicle. They get in the back, they're paying attention to everything. You might have the same experience, by the way, when you get in a human-driven car, hyper attentive for the first minute or two, and then out comes the phone, and now you're like scrolling through your websites and email and that sort of thing. So I think people tend to be very accepting of the inherent safety of things unless they're getting very big negative signals. And so I think we have to be careful with that. We need to build the acceptance and the trust, but we also obviously need to be responsible in how we deploy the technology.
Yeah.
And I do think, just to build on the comments, that it's across all of us. I mean, it's the private sector, it's the public sector, and it's frankly the government. And the work that NHTSA has done with respect to the VSSAs, or the Voluntary Safety Submission Acts, that many of us have partaken in, which are available for the public to consume, tries to do that. How do we educate the consumers in normal everyday language so they get more comfortable with the technologies and our practices and our intent, so that they get more comfortable? But to echo the themes here is, we also at Ford believe that the more experience that we can afford the normal customers in our vehicles, the better feedback we're going to garner, and the better we can modify our experience. We do believe that the experience of the journey can be very different than a traditional vehicle, and our system is set up to deliver that, and we want to work together. And I do believe it's all of us, and it is an and, as you said, because the more people that we take through the vehicles, and the studies show people go from being very apprehensive to when they experience an autonomous vehicle to being much more comfortable. And I think that will continue to grow as we have more and more exposure, because in aggregate, we're in Miami and Dearborn, Ann Arbor, other places. You can hear how many cities around the world we have actually been able to engage with consumers, and it just needs to continue.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'll make a quick point and then throw it back over to you, which is, I think there's also an interesting opportunity here when you compare to human-operated vehicles, where every time you get in a car, you're not sure what you're getting. There's maybe this driver is fantastic, maybe they're terrifying. I sometimes get the text from my wife on her way home, like, if I die, I'm in this car, because she's a little scared by the level of at least perceived safety for the operator in the car. So here we have an opportunity too, as we start to build the technology, to say this technology, this stack, this platform is a very known quantity, and you're going to get the same experience no matter what car you get in.
Well, I was just going to add, I think from NHTSA's perspective, we feel that more public education outreach is definitely necessary. You see level 2 technology out there proliferating, and nobody, a lot of folks that are using those, I don't think know how they operate as well as they should. I also want to mention, there's some science here too. There's human factors, and I think, entities developing these systems need to do a lot of due diligence. You mentioned some work in getting some feedback and stuff as you're developing your systems, and so we're doing research at the agency as well on the telltale issue, and how to best communicate intent to other users outside of that automated vehicle. So I think that a strong focus on that human factors science is a sort of a foundational piece. So then when we get systems developed, they're intuitive for users to understand and operate. So I think also maybe a third piece, make sure these things are marketed appropriately.
Yes.
So
Yes.
the marketing is not here, and the actual is here, in terms of performance. And so don't overhype these systems, to make sure the public knows their strengths and their limitations in terms of how they can operate.
So it sounds like there's a lot of effort to gather information about the public and expose the public to the technology. But I think one of the things that nobody really touched on is that regulation is sort of setting the expectations. There's some assurance, because there are regulations, that these things are minimally safe, whatever that means. What effort is going on, or needs to be going on, to gather information about what the public's expectations are? Because you learn about expectations often in the aftermath of something that's gone wrong. Oh, I can't believe that that was allowed, right? So, but it seems that in the case if you're trying to create regulatory guidance for brand new technology, you need to start understanding what are the expectations of the people who will be riding around in these things. And has anybody efforts to understand what the public's expectation is, not just what their experience is and can they be comfortable with the technology, but are we missing something?
I think that's only part of it. I mean, one of the things that wasn't said in the last discussion was the first responder community also is thriving for information education. I think, I come at this from both ways. One is, definitely the Secretary of Transportation has placed a high emphasis on consumer education, and the VSSAs were mentioned by Desi, and there's 13 of them out there, I think, as of now, and yet if you look at the state of California, there's something like 62 people that have testing permits. So one would have to ask the question, what are the rest of them doing? Why are they not living up to the spirit of using a tool? It's one of many, but a tool to talk about how they're approaching safety, how they're talking about the technology. And to Tim's point, there's this conflict with sort of current technologies that people can buy today versus what we're talking about, which is the future.
Right.
And the Deputy Administrator made a strong point about this last week at SC Government Industry meeting, was this idea that there's a big difference between testing and operation. So when you talk about consumers' expectation, that is going to change versus here's a test vehicle that we're not quite ready yet, we're still learning, versus here's a deployed product where maybe there's some new learnings that happen over time. And I think we as an industry need to be very clear and careful about how we're talking about those two aspects, because they matter greatly how consumers understand that, and more importantly, how we talk about the challenges that we're all facing and how regulations fit into that. So to the point that, yes, often after some event, someone's like, oh, I can't believe that was allowed or whatever. That's where industry standards group come into play, because again, there's a foundation that's needed that then the regulators look at and say, okay, maybe this particular piece of it should be regulated and maybe not the whole entire enchilada. And I think we have to always keep that in mind. Like, it's not this one or the other thing, but it's a combination, a balance of a number of factors that go to overall safety, not just the regulations.
So what I would like to add to that is we're one of the organizations that has not published our VSSA. So
get on it.
Huh?
Get on it.
Well, the reason why
we have a template.
I've seen yours. The reason why, because when we read I haven't read the 13. I think there were 6 out that I read. I personally felt like a lot of it was marketing versus actual data. And so we made the conscious decision, 2 things. One, we're going to publish when we have actual real data that is good, bad, and the ugly, that can really give us insights into what we're doing. And then what we're going to do once we start publishing, we're going to publish live updates on good, bad, and the ugly. We really wanted to focus on what does it tell us, to your point, David, about what we should be thinking about, or what riders will expect, or what consumers will expect, rather than just saying, well, here's our approach. Yes, we could talk about ODD. Yes, we can talk about cybersecurity, but some of that stuff is table stakes, right? Like, you better have a secure vehicle, and so that was our perspective why we haven't published, is because we want to really focus on real world, actual data, actual consumer and rider feedback that informs us on how to improve. The second point is, when we put people in vehicles, they unequivocally know that it's a pilot vehicle, and it's for test and development purposes, and it's not a deployment vehicle at this time. So we certainly make that line very clear that we're not operating commercially at this point.
Yeah, I think, not to counter too much, but I think, last week I had the opportunity to sit down with the motor vehicle administrators. So for lack of a better expression, that's the DMV folks who, many of them across the country, are the ones wrestling with how to govern testing. And we were having a conversation about incident response plans. sort of what happens in a company when an incident happens, what is their triage routine, what do they do when they work with state regulators, et cetera. And one of the things that we were talking about was, why does Waymo and GM are basically the only two companies that have incident response plans and no one else does? And one of the richness of the conversation that came out was, not despite David's point about the whole we wanted to make sure we had something to say, what was recounted back to me was, don't discount the value of even how much that little bit of information helps. Because if you look at Waymo's incident response plan, a large portion of it is essentially pieces of the Chrysler Pacifica owner's manual. It's settled differently, but a large portion of it is. There's nothing new in there about battery systems, there's nothing new in there about how the vehicle disables itself, et cetera. But the first responder community, for their efforts, found it extremely, extremely valuable. Extremely valuable because why? Their assumption was there was something different going on, that somehow the companies were not being very serious about safety, or they weren't thinking about all those issues. And so, yes, agree, a lot of them, ours included, might look like high glossy stuff, but actually we've gone through and actually analyzed all 13 of them, and there actually are some stark differences about how different companies are approaching safety. And so there is actually some information in those VSSAs that is actually useful.
Yeah, and I think you see it evolve too.
You see it
those
evolve.
who came out first, are now benefiting from, or those who came out later are benefiting from those who came out first, and I think you'll see those evolve and change as well.
Absolutely.
And I know we were, I wouldn't say we were critical of them, but we certainly saw them, for the glossy marketing pieces that they were in the early editions. And so I think, provided that the industry is honest and transparent, those things are valuable. So I would say when.
So I think the point on that is, just because we haven't published doesn't mean we don't have a first responders manual or incident manual, which we all do.
Yeah.
And so we just haven't decided to go the route of publishing a formal VSSA, which I won't make news
is
today.
coming.
Yes, it certainly is coming.
And this is a tricky line to walk, right? This is a highly competitive space right now from a technology standpoint, and
that's right.
Extremely hot from an investor angle, right? So there's this intense desire to try and measure and compare and analyze and pick winners in a world where there are hundreds of different companies chasing this same thing. So I think you have to find the way to move forward and cooperate to drive safety, while also kind of respecting the competitive piece. And so one example of that, Aptiv released a large body of fully annotated sensor sets called New Scenes. You can go online, search it, and check it out. But that's one of the things that we tried to do, is say, look, we're not going to share all of our proprietary algorithms, but if we can share a data set that has a ground truth to it, this is perception focused obviously, but if we can share this data set that has a ground truth to it, it's going to be that much easier for companies to actually benchmark themselves and understand how they're doing relative to where they need to be from a safety standpoint, or just where their competitors may be at a point in time. So I do think that there are smart ways that you can address the question of what's the competency of our stack and our technology, and is it ready, is it safe, without giving away all of the secrets.
Just one point, I feel like the spokesperson for VSSA, but one of the things that my journey myself, because I kind of did the same mental kind of check-in, like what are we doing, who is this for, some nice glossy pictures, but what are we really getting? And I had to kind of remind myself through listening to my team, is this submission is really not for the techno geeks.
Right.
It's for the overall consumer, and for
That's
those
right.
people that are more apprehensive. I actually love your example of cybersecurity, because that is an area people are uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
And I think that all of our VSSAs are different, maybe not deliberately different, but they actually contribute to a different piece of the total puzzle. Back to that whole building trust. If we as a community can't find a way to coalesce and to collaborate in communicating and sharing some data, which we traditionally aren't good at, let's just be honest, this is not our strength of ours innately. I think we can actually help the regulators see a way to get to a place where we can actually create the and environment. We can enable next generation technologies that deliver autonomous vehicles in a manner that is more conducive to expediency. And I'd say, just think about it, because I went through that journey.
Right. No, look.
I'm done coaching now.
No. We the VSSA has been on the first VSSA draft.
Yeah.
We created in October of 2017. So we've been on this journey.
No, that's great.
For the time. We just have not published.
So I'd be interested in hearing from Tim, if he's willing to answer whether or not you think that the VSSAs contain the information that you as a regulator need to start contemplating regulations, or do you need more detailed information?
I mean, I think it's a good start, and I think it's been a little uneven in terms of the level of information in those VSSAs. I find some quite informative and insightful on what companies are doing, not necessarily the later submissions either.
It depends.
Particularly some early submission I felt was quite good. It sort of level sets our expectation too. Like if we provide this opportunity for industry to provide a voluntary basis, these VSSAs, and it's like crickets chirping, probably tells us that maybe we didn't identify the right basic safety pieces in our national policy or whatever, but quite the contrary. It seems like not only are those things being addressed at different levels, but they've been pretty embraced. Those do seem to be the foundational safety elements, and so we think it's a good start. But things like the notice that we had on our the pilot program, if that is the right mechanism, or mechanisms like that, are going to need to happen to get to a much deeper level, of course, of data in terms of driving, I think, federal policy and that type of thing. So,
and there's a lot of engagement happening outside of this extremely public, disclosure of information, right? Obviously, there's conversations happening with DOT and NHTSA and actually among industry as well around what's the right way to try and drive safety forward.
Well, of course, and I assume there has been those conversations, because there always have been those conversations, but that is behind the closed doors.
Yep,
it
that's
isn't
right.
exactly providing the forward-looking or public-looking assurance that somebody is making sure that these things as they evolve are going to be safe, and that at the end of the day is the purpose of regulation.
Yes.
Is
well,
to provide some kind of public assurance. Yeah. So one of the questions that came in, and something that we touched on, is sort of like the regulatory process and the speed with the regulatory process. I mean, do any of you envision that there will ever be regulations addressing how the automated driving systems make their decisions, or is it just going to be left in the sort of more vague space of industry best practice and so forth?
I hope they're not specifying how to solve the technology problem.
Right.
I mean, it's classically the way that rules of the road, let's take driver licensing today, works is you evaluate performance, right? You say, look, here are some basic rules, don't violate these rules, don't hit things, don't violate traffic rules, and you then can look at the performance of a vehicle and say, look, are you violating those rules or not? And if you're violating those rules, then you're going to get in trouble for that. I would hope we don't ever reach a point where we're saying this is precisely how you should make decisions, because I think that will significantly narrow the opportunity to build better systems and safer systems, frankly. But I do think obviously there's a place to continue to define. Look, here are the particular rules that need to be followed, and in fact, one of the things that I think we struggle with the current state of rules is that they're very, they're made for humans. They're made for humans with judgment, and then when somebody does something, a jury of their peers or a judge or somebody kind of evaluates whether that was a reasonable thing to do or an unreasonable thing to do. And that's sort of not the preferred way to go through evaluation of performance. I think there's an opportunity to significantly clarify, quantify some of the rules of the road that are out there today. When overtaking a cyclist, leave a safe distance. Well, okay, we all kind of know what that means, but if that was more explicit or more prescriptive, or even just a framework existed to be able to say, what is our definition of safe, and do others agree with that? I think there's an opportunity to remove a lot of ambiguity from that set of rules.
I mean, typically for NHTSA, of course, we're historically performance-based, vehicle level-based type tests, and so you could make a certain argument that the decision-making piece, all of the subcomponent pieces that are in that vehicle, if you had a robust enough set of tests through simulation and physical testing, that decision-making is getting exercised. And I think the key is it getting exercised in all of the variations that could occur out there, or is some anomaly going to crop up where it makes a wrong decision and does something unsafe. And so I think it's an open question on like decision making and the whole software issue in general. Obviously we feel the agency has authority over software in terms of if there's something that's deployed that is making a vehicle unsafe, we have authority to look at that and remedy it if necessary. But that's going to be an interesting area, and I think it's an area that's again going to be driven a lot by research, both in government and industry. Are there some subsystem, some component level testing that we now need to get into? But I think to a large degree, it's still going to revolve around vehicle level performance-based tests unless sort of proven otherwise.
And we have an opportunity to make vehicles safer. If we look at the stats from last year alone, over 37,000 people were killed in accidents that were related to a driver's error or a human error. And those alone help us, remind us that through robust autonomous framework and through infrastructure built around scenarios, we can absolutely do better. And so I'd say that the way the system works today is governing the vehicle. It should be no different than how we approach it in the future, but I like the idea of best practices. I think it builds back on collaboration. We're learning a lot, and it's up to us as a community to be able to share those best practices that we feel are intellectual property neutral, and I think there is a lot of that.
And again, just to emphasize, again, historically we've done performance-based, vehicle-based, but as you can see from the agency's notices, we want more information on how can we get better data, how can we get more comprehensive testing out there. And again, I go back to the pilot notice a lot, but we said quite clearly in there that depending on sort of what the data tells us in terms of what's needed in terms of maybe frameworks moving forward, if there are new frameworks that are needed moving forward, it'll be informed by that. So I don't want to say we've historically did it this way and we're just going to continue to do that into the future. I think there's a lot more research and a lot more information that's going to sort of drive those decisions, both industry and government.
Yeah. Well, one thing I think in this conversation that we greatly underestimate, and again, historically, when you've had vehicle development cycles from concept to production of 5 to 7 years, 7 to 10 years in some cases, you can take 3-4 years to figure out rulemaking and frameworks for new regulation. Our focus and what we've introduced is we can go from concept to production ready in 12 months. We are all about speed to market. And for us, it really is, we have to be laser focused on that speed to market. And here's the challenge. Whereas Ford, GM, and some of the other large OEMs have had relatively good financial years, I think billions of dollars in profit over the last several years, and have significant R&D budgets. Newer players, we all can't be Uber, right, Nat? We all can't have billions of dollars in our war chest. So if we don't get a decision in terms of some sort of indication and consistent indication of where regulation is heading in 3 to 6 months, we may have missed the boat. Investors have gone and said, hey, we're going to place our bets somewhere else. And this is where I think, and I've had these conversations with your colleagues at DOT and NHTSA, is other countries are running laps around the United States in this space. So KPMG just published, for example, their AV readiness survey again. I think the United States was 6th. Number 1 was Netherlands. We just deployed in Australia. We worked with their Minister of Transportation, and in 6 months they helped us go from importing a vehicle to actually putting it on public roads. Now I know in the United States the importers also have a loophole that they can work through, so I guess the lesson learned is if you're an importer, you get benefits to deploying all over the world. But joking aside, speed to market and getting, it doesn't have to be 100% right. Can we get to 80 and can we all manage to risk in a collaborative way? We also don't want to do what California did in 2011 and is go out there and write a bunch of rules and then realize, oh, the technology actually leapfrogged and we have to rewrite rules, right? So we got to find a balance, but I think one urgent thing that I would encourage us all to think about is what's the right 80-20 rule, can we get to an agree, and do we have speed to market? Because as an industry and as a country, I think we want to keep a leadership position in deploying this technology around the country and the world.
So let me put you on the spot. What do you think is the right rule?
No, sorry, right framework.
Right framework.
I should have said right framework. I'm not saying a specific rule, I should say the framework to get to market.
And I agree. I think there's this topic of how do you align regulation across local, state, federal, international.
Right.
And I think anyone who wants to be ultimately an international player has to be able to inhabit all these different regulatory layers. And so I think there's an opportunity to have a scalable framework. So I don't expect that the rules will be the same in every single place that we operate. But if we can create the right scalable framework that says, look, this is how we articulate the rules, this is what the rules mean, this is their relative priority. There are opportunities to then, as technology developers, be able to respond to work within that framework. When building hardware, things have to kind of look more or less the same. When building software, you have the opportunity to be more nimble and be responsive to local regulations. It's something that Aptiv has learned just operating Singapore, Boston, Las Vegas, Pittsburgh. We already have to have a certain amount of flexibility within our software to handle, Singapore, they drive on the other side of the road, for example. Right. So there's a piece that has to be solved.
But we can't create an environment around loopholes and who has an advantage, whether you're a dinosaur in the industry or a newcomer. And I don't consider us a dinosaur. I think we're here to recreate ourselves and to offer the knowledge that a 100+ year company has around vehicles, infrastructure, consumer expectations, experiences, and frankly, scale. So I think that don't dismiss us completely, because we're a player in this going forward. But I also think that we help to alleviate some of the consumers' concerns around basic safety and frankly security. We're experts. We aren't the normal customer, and we need to remind ourselves that. And
Yes.
so a lot of times what's really obvious to us sitting here in this enormous facility is not obvious to the Joe Q public. They don't understand this.
Right.
They don't understand why all of this regulatory discussion even happens. And so I remind us that we all have a role to play. This is super exciting,
Yep.
and it's super different, but it's not insignificant. And our lens, you can listen to us, our lenses are different. We've experienced different things as individuals and as companies, but I think that together we can not only enable innovation and autonomous vehicles, but we can enable our country to be in a leadership position to have this framework that eventually becomes harmonious. And I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because we literally are preaching to the choir. Everyone here has already drank the Kool-Aid and they know, and that's not the audience we should be, talking to. And I totally understand your point, and I know there's such disparity between, the small startups and the budgets they have, and the companies who are investing hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars in developing this technology. analogy, but one thing we do know is you literally get one bite at the apple. And if it doesn't roll out and deploy in a way that consumers are on the journey with you and they're bought in and they trust it because there's transparency and there's consistency and the government is a part of it, unfortunately, I think you set back the entire industry, maybe permanently, certainly for a long period of time. And so I think cautious rollout is important.
I don't think it was.
Maybe before we go to the cautious part, I think that for those of us that have been doing motor vehicle safety for a very long time, it's easy to forget how hard it is. And I think some of the conversation up here is kind of maybe going in the wrong direction, maybe a little bit from what the question was, which was, do we ever think this technology is going to be regulated? And I think, not speaking for the many men and women at DOT and NHTSA working very hard with a very robust research program to answer many of the hard questions that frankly, if we were to spend half of 1% and all the billions of dollars that are being spent on AV development, probably a lot of those questions would already be answered. And so I think Congress certainly believes it should be regulated at some point. They certainly have, trying to pass a bill. They'll probably try again that, maybe goes too far. I'm not here to pass judgment on it, but I think there are a lot of things in there that spoke to Kelly's point, like there's a lot of angst out there because of the way sometimes tech comes across, or sometimes the way the industry in general comes across about approaching this problem. We got to remember, at the end of the day, the long pole really in the tent is the safety of, can this thing get from point A to point B, without crashing, essentially. And I think everything else kind of stems from there. So best practices are certainly a good start. Getting everyone to agree on maybe a set of principles. Oh, and how about actually what defines safe testing? How about we start there? I think there are ways to build consensus, to build progress towards safety without going straight for sort of the jugular of oh, we need new regulations, and oh my God, the regulations are in the way. You and I, right? We had this great experience on AEB. This technology that was out there, everybody in the industry was working on it. Dave and I got together and said, how about we figure out how to get this standardized? We didn't shoot for the moon, but we certainly were able to get a platform, and guess what? By 2021, every new car sold will have automatic emergency braking as a standard feature. No regulation, started with best practices, started with NHTSA test procedures, and here we are sitting on sort of something that's very successful. You can apply that same model to this space, but we have to be very specific about what we're talking about, because what David is struggling with is a very real issue, which is he has a new mode of transportation he's trying to figure out and looking for a regulatory solution. We, on the other hand, are operating a platform and can buy from whomever to operate on our platform, but we need it to be safe. So at the end of the day, we both struggle with needing to find a safe floor, whatever that is, but at the same time, flexibility in the regulatory process to be able to allow those release valves when necessary.
I think facilitation.
So we're running up against the end of the time, and I want to give everybody a chance to say their final piece, right? So you each get about 1 minute from here, and we'll start with you, Eric.
Oh.
Wait, that'll be trouble. You have Tim down there.
I got to go second.
Yeah. I don't know that I have a lot to build on from what I said at the beginning. I would just say, I think there's also an opportunity for facilitation within the regulatory function. So we can look at other models. You look at things like the aviation industry, and one of the things they do is they say, you know what, near misses, we're going to create a safe space. You can come in, we can talk about near misses, this is shared amongst the industry, and we can all learn from it. So it's not best practices, but it is an opportunity to share information and learning. There are other interesting models out there as well, and in the vaccine world, and on and on. There are things that you can do to create a framework that allows for companies to push forward this safe technology. And at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to push forward new technology which will save lives without getting overburdened in the specifics of the regulation.
Well, we're just going to kind of pick up from our last discussion there and just add, I don't think there should be uncertainty in terms of the NHTSA regulatory framework or our authorities or our tools. Those have been in place for a long, long time. They're well known, they're well documented. any upgrading, modernization, any changes in those moving forward, I think as you mentioned, it's going to be a deliberative process, as it has to be. It has to be a notice and comment, we have to appropriately incorporate everybody's views. And so it's not like, I don't think there's going to be an FMVSS that pops up like in 2 weeks or something. Yeah. And so there shouldn't be this uncertainty on what the structure is. The structure in place can handle anything that's coming out the door right now. Anything. Our current structure can address it. And so there's tools in place. Could that structure be refined, maybe made more efficient, upgraded? Yes, but there's a current regulatory and authority structure in place that handles ADBs and anything down to level 0 right now. And so there shouldn't be uncertainty in that's in place now.
Yeah. So on that, I would agree with you that there's a structure. That structure is just not, I don't think, as flexible or as fast as certainly we would like. So what I will say specifically is, in terms of, Eric, your point about a global framework, right? I think a global framework needs to be in place that builds up on itself, because the question was, what does AV mean for regulation? I think it provides an opportunity for us to think as an industry, as a country, as a society, as a world, around how do we go from, 100 years ago we went from the horseless carriage to now 100 years later we're going for the driverless car. How do we go and bring new technology, and whether it's a scooter or an ollie or something in between, to market? And I think the framework goes through multiple stages of, we all have to test and pilot and prove our technology. Second, we have to have an incubation period where we understand, here's the existing rules, but this new technology does not necessarily apply within this existing rule, and these are things based on risk profiles that we can ignore, but these are things that we may need to add. And then when we figure that out through testing and piloting and the incubation period, which allows commercialization, we go to a commercialization phase where we then update your existing or whatever global framework we have in Europe, Australia, Korea, and so on. And then we go on and continue. I think the point that I want to keep pushing is, we just got to be faster, and we got to rethink how to deploy technology and not just look at the vehicle, but also the use cases in which the vehicle is deployed in order to assess safety.
Thank you, David. I think you made a lot of great comments around timing and how do we continue to collaborate and build an infrastructure to help our regulators go faster, because clearly they want to do the right thing. Their single agenda is to make our consumers safe, right, and to help hold us accountable. And I think we recognize that, but we also recognize we want to play a different role than we have in the past. And I'll just do a shout out to the SAE collaboration that we just announced last week in our review with NHTSA, that we're working as an industry to collaborate in this space because we recognize it as an opportunity. So sessions like today, us working together, and your continued support of innovation and delivering the framework to allow NHTSA and regulators to create something that is more nimble, but that's also different than it is today. Mm-hmm. We have to move off a system that is only based on physical feature-based assessments. We need to get to a performance-based system that enables us to have the flexibility that not only you guys need, that we all need. So thank you for the opportunity to sit on the panel today.
Yeah, I was going to actually talk about the industry collaboration, because I think that's absolutely the best step forward, and and that it just speaks right to what you were talking about. It can be done, it has been done. I think it's exciting. AVs are transformative, there's no question about it, from a safety, mobility, efficiency perspective, but seeing industry come together, develop standards, agree on some foundational standards, I think is absolutely critical, and eventually that'll evolve into regulation. I think that's the way it has to go.
Yeah, I think the topic of this panel was sort of interesting because it means a lot will change and a lot will happen. I think the challenge for regulators is to understand sort of the vast sea of differences that are out there, because this constant need for describing regulations has to take into account the variety, right? So a little robot that's only going to drive around and deliver groceries within, you know, a 3-block radius probably shouldn't have the same performance standards as a highway vehicle. And I think right now the flexibility is there to do that, but I think companies need to come forward with something that actually makes some sense from a safety standpoint. I'd also say that there's a bit of humility needed probably from the entire industry and sort of understanding that we have a lot to do. We're the ones wanting to bring this technology to market, so we are the ones that own this. Like, we can't toss it up to DOT to solve for us, and we can't toss it up to some international group to solve to us. We have to solve it. We have to work together, either through groups like SAE, with safety groups who have a lot to add to the conversation, and we cannot forget the public, who at the end of the day, you know, we're testing on public streets, and they have a right to know about what we're doing and that we're doing it in a safe and responsible way.
Well, thanks everybody. That was perfectly timed. To the second. Appreciate your thoughts. I didn't read any of the questions verbatim, but I think I've been monitoring the questions, and I think a lot of things that people were asking came up in the conversation naturally. So I thought it was a really good conversation, and thanks for all of you agreeing to come here today and talk about this complicated, very, very complicated issue of automated vehicles and driving systems and how and whether they should be regulated in the future.
Thank you all for
Thanks
the
very
opportunity.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.